It was supposed to be nothing more than a family portrait from 1901. But when Rebecca Miller looked closely at the child's hand, she noticed something that would change everything she thought she knew about her family. The attic of the old Baltimore townhouse had been untouched for decades. Dust floated through the weak afternoon sunlight coming through a dirty window. Old trunks, boxes, clothes, books, and forgotten belongings were scattered around the wooden beams. Rebecca had delayed cleaning the attic for months, but with the estate sale only a week away, she finally had no choice. She began sorting everything into 3 piles: keep, donate, and throw away. Most of the things were ordinary: old clothes, moth-eaten blankets, books with damaged covers, and objects nobody had used for years. Then her hand touched something hard beneath a layer of yellowed newspaper. She slowly pulled the paper away. Underneath was a heavy wooden frame. Inside was an old photograph. Rebecca froze. It was a formal family portrait from the beginning of the 20th century. A serious-looking man sat in an elegant chair, wearing a dark suit and thick mustache. Beside him sat a woman in a high-necked dress. Her hair pulled tightly back. 3 children stood between them. 2 blonde girls wore matching white dresses, while a young boy wore a sailor suit. But there was another child. He stood slightly away from the others. He was a black boy, perhaps 8 years old. His clothes were much simpler than those of the other children. His body looked tense, and his expression was not confident like the others. The white children looked directly at the camera. The boy did not. There was something in his eyes that caught Rebecca's attention. Fear, or maybe resignation. She carried the photograph closer to the window. As the light fell across the faded image, she noticed something she had missed before. The boy's right hand was hanging strangely at his side. Rebecca leaned closer. Around his wrist was a faint circular mark. At first she thought it might simply be damage in the old photograph. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. It looked like a scar, not an ordinary scar. It looked almost like an old rope burn. Rebecca's stomach tightened. Why would an 8-year-old child have a mark like that? She turned the frame over. Her grandmother had never talked about the family's history before 1920. Whenever Rebecca asked about the earlier years, her grandmother always changed the subject or gave vague answers. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, were only 4 words. The Thornton family, 1901. Rebecca took out her phone and photographed the picture. Something about it felt deeply wrong. The boy's expression, the scar, the way he stood apart from the other children. It seemed as though the photograph was hiding a story someone had desperately wanted forgotten. That night, Rebecca could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the boy's wrist. Who was he? Why was he in the photograph? Why had nobody ever mentioned him? And why had her grandmother kept this picture hidden for so many years? By morning, Rebecca had made up her mind. She was going to find the truth. She started online, searching census records, genealogy databases, and historical archives for the Thornton family in Baltimore around 1901. The results were strange. She found records for Harold and Constance Thornton and 3 children, Margaret, Elizabeth, and Charles. But there was no 4th child. There was no black boy. Rebecca stared at the screen. The absence itself seemed important. Someone had erased him from the family's official history. During her lunch break at the hospital where she worked, Rebecca drove to the Maryland Historical Society. The building was filled with old records and portraits of Baltimore's wealthy families. She asked to see city directories and newspaper archives from the early 1900s. An elderly librarian named Mrs. Patterson brought her several large leather-bound books. "The Thorntons?" the woman asked. Rebecca looked up. "You know them?" Mrs. Patterson adjusted her glasses. "Not personally, but I've worked here for more than 40 years. You begin to recognize which families wanted their histories remembered and which families wanted parts of them forgotten." Rebecca felt a chill. For several hours she searched through the directories. Harold Thornton was listed as a successful textile merchant with an address on Mount Vernon Place, one of Baltimore's wealthiest neighborhoods at the time. His business appeared frequently in newspapers. Everything looked respectable. Then Rebecca found an obituary from 1923. Harold Thornton had died at 68. The obituary praised his business success and charitable work. But one detail stopped Rebecca. It said he was survived by his wife and 3 children. 3, not 4. Rebecca photographed the obituary. The question was no longer whether the boy had been erased. He clearly had. The question was why. That evening, Rebecca called her mother in Florida. Mom, did Grandma ever mention the name Thornton? There was a long silence. Why are you asking? I found a photograph in the attic. It's from 1901. Another pause. Rebecca, some things are better left in the past. Mom, there's a child in the photograph. A black child. He has scars around his wrists. I need to know who he was. Her mother's voice became quiet. Your grandmother made me promise never to talk about it. Rebecca stared at the photograph on her desk. She said it would only bring pain. It is too late for that, Rebecca replied. The pain is already here. 3 days later, Rebecca was sitting in her mother's living room. She had taken emergency leave from work and flown from Baltimore to Florida. Her mother, Catherine, sat by the window holding the photograph. She stared at the frightened child for a long time. Finally, she spoke. His name was Thomas. Rebecca leaned forward. Thomas what? We don't know his real surname. That is what they called him. Tell me everything. Catherine took a deep breath. Your great-great-grandfather Harold Thornton was not the respectable, charitable businessman described in his obituary. Rebecca said nothing. In 1901, more than 35 years after slavery was abolished, there were still people who found ways to keep black children under their control. Rebecca's face changed. What do you mean? Black children who had lost their parents or whose families had disappeared could be taken under the excuse of apprenticeship or domestic service, but sometimes it was slavery under another name. Rebecca slowly looked at the photograph again. Harold Thornton kept Thomas? Yes. Catherine's voice trembled. He brought Thomas into the Thornton household when the boy was 6. Thomas was kept in the servants' quarters. He worked from early morning until late at night. He cleaned, he cooked, he cared for the horses, he did whatever the household demanded. He was not allowed to leave the property. He was not allowed to receive a proper education. Rebecca looked at the scars. Those marks. Rope, Catherine said quietly. They tied him whenever they left the house because they were afraid he would run away. Rebecca felt sick. Then why is he in the family photograph? Catherine looked at her. That is where the story changes. She went to her bedroom and returned with a small wooden box. Inside were several old letters. They belonged to your great-great-grandmother, Constance. Rebecca opened the first letter carefully. The handwriting was elegant but unsteady. It was written to Constance's sister Harriet. The letter described a woman who could no longer live with what was happening inside her own home. Harold claimed that providing Thomas with food and shelter made everything legal. Constance did not believe him. She wrote that she could see the fear in Thomas's eyes and the marks on his wrists. She heard him crying at night. She knew her own children were sleeping safely, while another child suffered only a few rooms away. Rebecca looked up. She knew it was wrong. She did more than know, Catherine answered. She decided to act. The letters continued for months. In March 1901, Constance secretly began teaching Thomas to read. When Harold was away and her own children were at school, she brought Thomas into the library. He learned the alphabet quickly, but she was terrified Harold would discover what she was doing. One day he unexpectedly returned home. Thomas had to hide behind a curtain while Harold entered the room. Constance wrote that she was not afraid for herself. She was afraid of what Harold might do to Thomas. Then came another letter. April 22nd, 1901. Constance wrote that she had heard Harold beating Thomas in the stable because the boy had accidentally broken a harness. She ran outside and tried to stop him. For the first time in 18 years of marriage, she openly stood against her husband. She told him that what he was doing was evil. She told him that keeping a child in bondage and denying him education was no different from the slavery the country had fought a war to end. Harold struck her. He called her a fool. He called her a traitor. He told her Thomas was his property. That was the moment Constance made her final decision. She would free Thomas, with or without Harold's permission. Catherine handed Rebecca another document. It was a legal statement from a lawyer named Joseph Brennan dated June 1901. It stated that Thomas, described as a minor child of approximately 8 years old, was being held unlawfully by Harold Thornton. Constance was asking for legal help to secure his freedom. Rebecca understood how dangerous this was. A married woman publicly challenging her husband could destroy the family's reputation, but Constance no longer cared. She had already contacted a network of Quaker families in Pennsylvania. They had agreed to take Thomas, educate him, and help him start a new life. Then Rebecca discovered something even more shocking. Constance had planned to use the family portrait as evidence. A letter dated June 3, 1901, explained everything. Harold wanted a formal family portrait. He wanted the world to see a successful and respectable Baltimore family. But Constance had secretly arranged for Thomas to appear in the photograph. The photographer, William Ashford, supported her plan. Thomas would already be standing in the frame when Harold arrived. Once the photograph was taken, Harold could not erase the evidence that Thomas had been part of the household. Rebecca could suddenly imagine the scene: the photographer's studio, the tall windows, the smell of photographic chemicals, Thomas standing nervously to one side, Constance beside him, then Harold arriving with the other children. His anger must have been immediate. What is that boy doing here? But the photographer refused to move Thomas. The portrait had been arranged. Everyone would remain where they were. Harold could have walked out, but doing so would have raised questions. So he stayed. He sat rigidly in his chair. His jaw was tight. The children looked confused. They had been taught to ignore Thomas, but that day they were all placed in the same frame. And then the photograph was taken. When the flash went off, Thomas flinched. Constance reached out and steadied him. The camera captured the moment. The image that Rebecca had found more than a century later was that same photograph. But Constance had another reason for making sure Thomas was visible. She wanted proof. Proof that he existed. Proof that he lived in their household. Proof that Harold had kept him there. After the photograph was taken, Harold confronted Constance. He told her she would regret what she had done. But Constance had already made copies of the photograph. One was held by her lawyer. She warned Harold that if anything happened to Thomas, the evidence would go to the authorities and newspapers. For the first time, Harold understood that he could no longer control the situation. But Thomas still had to escape Baltimore. That would be much harder than Constance had expected. Harold had connections throughout the city. She could not simply put Thomas on a train and hope nobody noticed. Through Joseph Brennan, she contacted a man named Elijah Warren. Elijah was in his 60s and had once worked with the Underground Railroad. Although slavery had officially ended decades earlier, Elijah had never stopped helping people who needed a safe path to freedom. Constance met him quietly in a small church. He agreed to take Thomas north. They would travel at night. They would use houses and churches that had once sheltered escaped slaves. The route would pass through Wilmington and then Philadelphia. Then Elijah arrived. Thomas disappeared into the darkness with him. Constance stood there watching until they were gone. For 4 days she waited. No message came. Then, on the 5th day, a telegram arrived from Philadelphia. Thomas had arrived safely. Constance collapsed with relief. But Harold soon discovered what had happened when he found Thomas's quarters empty. He confronted his wife. Constance placed the family photograph on the table. Thomas is gone, she told him. He is in Philadelphia, where he will receive an education and a future. She warned Harold that if he tried to bring the boy back, she would take the photograph and her testimony to every newspaper in Baltimore. Harold did not react the way she expected. Instead of shouting, he sat down. He looked broken. He accused Constance of destroying the family. She answered that the family had already been destroyed by what he had done to a child. Their marriage never truly recovered. They remained together for appearances but lived separate lives. Harold continued his business. Constance devoted herself to charitable work, this time genuinely helping children. She eventually established a fund for orphans. The truth about Thomas, however, remained hidden. The photograph was put away. The letters were hidden. and Thomas's name disappeared from the family's public history. But Constance never stopped following his life. Years later, she learned that Thomas had enrolled in school in Philadelphia. He was excellent at reading and mathematics. He completed his education despite beginning late. He later attended Lincoln University. In 1917, he graduated and became a teacher. He dedicated his life to educating black children. He eventually became a principal. He married, he raised a family, and he never forgot the woman who had helped him escape for decades. Constance and Thomas exchanged letters. Then in 1945, Constance received the final news. Thomas had died peacefully at the age of 52, surrounded by his family. He had spent his life teaching children. He had helped more than 1,000 students learn to read and think for themselves. He had transformed the suffering of his childhood into a reason to help others. Rebecca sat silently after hearing the story. She looked once more at the old photograph. What had first appeared to be a disturbing family portrait was now something much more powerful. It was evidence. It was a record of cruelty. But it was also proof of courage. And most importantly, it was the beginning of Thomas's journey from captivity to freedom. Rebecca knew she could no longer allow the photograph to remain hidden. The story had been buried for more than a century. Now it needed to be told.